Giant Slayer.
Who says I'm running away from anything? Maybe I'm running towards something.
They put into your mouth.
What?
Fear of heights, fear of falling. Well, then don't fall.
Am I dead?
Not just yet. Our mission is...
I pray as your daughter finds her way down.
And if something else... Faye! Fire!
What if a simple farm boy suddenly had to face a kingdom full of deadly giants? Jack, the giant slayer, is packed with epic battles, crazy adventures, and surprising facts you probably missed. Stay tuned to Sonu Hub for the full movie review, story, and amazing facts. Jack the Giant Slayer, which was originally called Jack the Giant Killer, is a 2013 American fantasy adventure movie directed by Bryan Singer. The screenplay was written by Darren Lemke, Christopher McQuarrie, and Dan Studney, based on a story by Lemke and David Dobkin. The movie is inspired by the classic British fairy tales Jack the Giant Killer and Jack and the Beanstalk. It stars Nicholas Hoult, Eleanor Tomlinson, Stanley Tucci, Ian McShane, Bill Nighy, and Ewan McGregor. The story follows Jack, a young farmhand who suddenly gets caught up in a crazy and dangerous adventure. Everything changes when Jack accidentally opens a magical gateway that connects his world to the land of the giants high up in the sky. When the giants come through, they kidnap a princess, and Jack has no choice but to step up and try to save her. Along the way, he has to deal with a powerful group of giants while also facing a greedy and dishonest lord who has his own plans for the kingdom. The development of Jack the Giant Slayer started back in 2005 when writer Darren Lemke first came up with the idea for the movie. A few years later, in January 2009, DJ Caruso was hired to direct the film. However, things changed in September of that same year when Caruso was replaced by Bryan Singer. After taking over as director, Singer brought in Christopher McQuarrie and Dan Studney to rewrite and improve the screenplay. The main cast was chosen between February and March 2011. Filming officially started in April 2011 in England. The production team shot scenes in several locations, including Somerset, Gloucestershire, and Norfolk. Because the movie depended heavily on huge visual effects, giant creatures, and large fantasy action scenes, the release date was later pushed back during post-production. The extra time was needed to finish the visual effects and give the studio more time to work on the movie's marketing. Jack the Giant Slayer had its world premiere on February 26, 2013 in Hollywood. Warner Bros. Pictures released the movie in theaters across the United States on March 1, 2013. The movie received mixed reactions from critics. Some people liked the fantasy adventure, action, visuals, and performances, while others felt the story and characters could have been better. Even though the movie had a big cast, a huge fantasy world, and a massive production budget, it didn't do as well as the studio hoped at the box office. Jack the Giant Slayer made around 197.7 million worldwide, while its production budget was estimated to be between $185 million and $200 million. Because of its extremely high budget and additional marketing costs, the movie was considered a box office failure. Overall, Jack the Giant Slayer is a modern action-packed take on the classic Jack and the Beanstalk style story. It mixes fantasy, adventure, giants, magic battles, and a rescue mission into one big Hollywood adventure. In the kingdom of Cloister, a young farm boy named Jack is fascinated by the old legend of Eric, a legendary king who once defeated an army of giant creatures that came from a mysterious kingdom high in the sky. According to the legend, Eric was able to control the giants using a powerful magical crown. The crown was made from the beating heart of a giant that had been killed long ago. The giants had originally reached Earth through a magical beanstalk. A special magic bean was planted in the ground, and from it grew a massive beanstalk that reached all the way into the sky and connected Earth to the giants' kingdom. The giants came down to Earth and started causing chaos, stealing everything they could and terrorizing the people. But Eric managed to stop them. Using the magical crown, he took control of the giants and ordered them to return to their kingdom, which existed somewhere between heaven and earth. After Eric eventually died, he was buried with the magical crown. The remaining magic beans were also hidden away because they were the only way to connect the human world with the giant's kingdom. At the same time, Princess Isabelle becomes interested in the same old legend. She is curious about the story of Eric and the giants and wonders whether the legend could actually be true. 10 years later, Jack travels into town to sell his horse because he needs money to help support his uncle's farm. While he is there, he spots Princess Isabelle and immediately develops a crush on her. When a group of thugs starts giving Isabelle trouble, Jack steps in and stands up for her. Meanwhile, Lord Roderick, the man who is supposed to marry Isabelle, returns to his private study and discovers that a monk has broken into his room and robbed him. Roderick had secretly hidden Eric's magical crown in his chambers, but now he realizes that the magic beans are gone too. Knowing how dangerous the beans are, Roderick orders the entire city to be locked down so nobody can leave. The monk who stole the beans meets Jack and offers him some of the magic beans as collateral for Jack's horse. The monk claims he will pay Jack later and asks him to bring the beans to the abbey. Jack has no idea how dangerous these beans really are, so he accepts the deal. Back at the castle, Princess Isabelle argues with her father, King Bramwell. Isabelle wants to travel around the kingdom and experience the world for herself, but her father wants her to stay inside the castle and marry Lord Roderick. He believes Roderick is the right man for her and doesn't want his daughter taking unnecessary risks at Jack's home. His uncle is also furious with him. He thinks Jack was completely foolish for accepting a few beans instead of actual money for the horse. His uncle throws the beans onto the floor and walks away. While Jack is picking them up, one of the beans accidentally rolls into the basement. Wanting to escape her sheltered life, Isabelle sneaks out of the castle. When heavy rain starts falling, she looks for somewhere to hide and accidentally ends up at Jack's house. She has no idea that one of the magic beans is sitting in the basement. As the rainwater reaches the bean, something unbelievable happens. The bean suddenly begins to grow, creating a giant magical beanstalk. The beanstalk grows bigger and bigger until it lifts Jack's entire house into the sky. Isabelle is trapped inside the house as it rises toward the giant's kingdom. Jack tries to save her, but the house is already being carried higher and higher. He desperately reaches for Isabelle, but he falls back to the ground. Isabelle is taken into the sky, while Jack is left behind holding her bracelet. The next morning, the king's men discover Jack lying unconscious on the ground. When they find Isabelle's bracelet with him, they demand to know what happened. Jack explains everything about the giant beanstalk and how Isabelle was carried into the sky. Roderick quickly realizes what happened. He understands that one of the magic beans must have gotten wet and grown into a beanstalk. Knowing that Isabelle is now trapped in the giant's world, Jack agrees to help rescue her. Jack, Lord Roderick, and Roderick's servant Vic join the king's knights. The group is led by the brave commander Elmont, with Crow serving as his second in command. Together they begin climbing the enormous beanstalk to search for Princess Isabelle. But while they are climbing, Roderick secretly cuts the safety rope. He does this on purpose, causing several of the knights to fall to their deaths. Roderick clearly has his own plans and doesn't care who gets hurt along the way. When the group finally reaches the top, they discover the massive kingdom of the giants. The place is unlike anything they have ever seen. The giants are enormous, dangerous creatures who are waiting for their chance to attack the human world again. The group decides to split up. Jack, Elmont, and Crow form one team, while Roderick and Vic go off together. Before they separate, Roderick takes all the remaining magic beans from Jack by force. However, Jack secretly manages to keep one bean for himself. Jack's group soon runs into trouble. A giant captures them and takes them prisoner. Somehow, Jack manages to escape while Elmont and Crow are captured. Meanwhile, Roderick and Vic run into two other giants. Things quickly go south when one of the giants grabs Vic and eats him. The giant then prepares to do the same thing to Roderick, but Roderick has one major advantage. He puts on Eric's magical crown, and its power immediately allows him to control the giants. Instead of being eaten, Roderick becomes their new master. Jack follows the giant who captured his friends and eventually reaches the giant's stronghold. There he discovers that the giant leader, a terrifying two-headed giant named Fallon, has killed Crow. Jack also finds Princess Isabelle and Elmont imprisoned inside the stronghold. Just as the giants are getting ready to kill the remaining prisoners, Roderick arrives wearing the magical crown. He uses its power to enslave the giants and take control of their entire army. Roderick tells the giants that they will attack the kingdom of Gloucester at dawn. He doesn't care about the people or even the princess. In fact, he orders the giants to eat Isabelle and Elmont. Jack refuses to let that happen. He sneaks around and manages to rescue Isabelle and Elmont. At one point, a giant is about to cook Elmont like a giant-sized pig in a blanket, but Jack arrives just in time and saves him. The three of them make a run for the magical beanstalk. A giant is guarding the path, so Jack comes up with a plan. He tricks the giant and causes it to fall over the edge of the giant's kingdom. Back on Earth, King Bramwell sees the enormous giant fall from the sky. Realizing how dangerous the beanstalk is, he orders his men to cut it down. He knows that if the beanstalk remains standing, the entire giant army could use it to reach Earth. Jack and Isabelle begin climbing down the beanstalk. Elmont stays behind because he still has unfinished business with Roderick. Elmont confronts Roderick and eventually kills him. But before Elmont can take the magical crown, Fallon grabs it. With the crown now in the hands of the giant leader, Elmont has no choice but to escape down the beanstalk. Jack, Isabelle, and Elmont manage to survive when the beanstalk is finally cut down. However, the danger isn't over yet. Before returning home, Jack realizes something terrifying. Roderick still had the magic beans, and the giants can use those beans to grow more beanstalks. That means the giants now have a way to send their entire army down to earth and attack Cloister. Sure enough, the giants begin growing more beanstalks and launching their invasion. Jack, Isabelle, and King Bramwell race back toward the castle as the giant army comes after them. The situation gets completely out of control. Elmont fills the castle moat with oil and sets it on fire to slow the giants down. The plan works for a moment, but Fallon manages to survive. He falls into the moat and then breaks into the castle from underneath. The siege becomes a full-blown battle. The giants storm the castle, and Fallon manages to capture both Jack and Isabelle. It looks like there is no way out, but Jack still has one final magic bean. In a desperate move, Jack throws the last bean directly into Fallon's mouth. The bean begins growing inside the giant, causing a massive beanstalk to burst through Fallon's body and tear him apart. With Fallon finally defeated, Jack grabs the magical crown using its power. He takes control of the remaining giants and orders them to return to their kingdom in the sky. The giant invasion is finally over. Jack has gone from being an ordinary farm boy to a true hero. After everything they have been through, Jack and Princess Isabelle fall in love and eventually get married. They live happily together and later tell their children the incredible story of the giants and the magical beanstalk. As many years pass, the magical crown eventually becomes something far more famous. It is transformed into St. Edward's crown and is eventually kept safely inside the Tower of London. And just like that, the incredible story of Jack, Isabelle, the giants, and the magical beanstalk becomes a legendary tale passed down through generations. Casting. The casting process for the 2013 fantasy adventure began in earnest during pre-production under director Bryan Singer, following the project's earlier development phases. In November 2010, Singer initiated screen tests for the male and female leads after New Line Cinema greenlit pre-production work. For the central role of the young farmhand Jack, candidates included Aaron Johnson, known at the time for his breakout in Kick-Ass, Aneurin Barnard, and Nicholas Hoult. Hoult had already registered on Singer's radar through his performance in the television series Skins and his supporting turn in A Single Man. Singer had also been instrumental in securing Hoult the role of Beast in X-Men First Class, which Singer produced. This prior collaboration created a natural pathway for considering Hoult for the lead. Hoult's path to the role involved multiple stages. He had first encountered the project years earlier during press for A Single Man when he met casting director Roger Mussenden and read an early version of the script. Activity then quieted while Singer focused on pre-visualization and technical planning for the performance Capture Giants and 3D photography. Hall's schedule conflicted when Mad Max Fury Road was expected to film concurrently, causing him to miss the initial round of screen tests. After that, production faced delays and Hall completed work on X-Men First Class. Opportunities reopened. He completed several auditions and screen tests with Singer. Singer later described meeting many candidates before settling on Hoult, praising him as a charming and sweet actor who had demonstrated strong work in previous projects. One practical observation Singer noted was Hoult's height. In a film centered on giants, shorter actors might have been preferred for visual contrast. yet Halsey's talent outweighed that consideration. Hoult himself recalled Singer indicating early interest, but needing to convince other stakeholders of the fit. The decision solidified in February 2011 when Hoult was offered the part. Princess Isabelle required a performer capable of blending royal poise with adventurous spirit and independence. Screen tests for the role involved Adelaide Kane, Lily Collins, and Juno Temple. Eleanor Tomlinson ultimately secured the part after an intensive process that she later described as 7 separate auditions. These included a chemistry read opposite Howell and a theatrical read-through with the assembled cast before the offer was finalized. Tomlinson recalled the experience as nerve-wracking, particularly the final stages when she still had not received confirmation. Upon learning she had the role while in her hometown village with her mother, she described an overwhelming mix of emotion that left her falling over, screaming, crying, and laughing simultaneously. The script at the time included an early sequence in which Isabelle disguises herself as a boy to avoid recognition, a detail that evolved during production. Tomlinson's casting was announced in March 2011, positioning her as Holt's on-screen counterpart. Supporting roles filled out rapidly around the same period. Stanley Tucci was cast in February 2011 as Lord Roderick, the ambitious advisor to the king who schemes to seize power. Tucci, the sole major non-British member of the principal cast, adopted a British accent for the role, an opportunity he had long sought. Singer viewed the character as whimsical and flamboyant, qualities that aligned with Tucci's established range in both dramatic and comedic work. Ewan McGregor joined later that same month as Elmont, captain of the Royal Guards and leader of the rescue expedition. Singer characterized McGregor's casting as a natural fit for an Errol Flynn-style heroic knight. McGregor later explained that the script's tone, which reminded him of the animated How to Train Your Dragon in its blend of humor and adventure, overcame any initial skepticism about a Jack and the Beanstalk adaptation. Ian McShane was cast in March 2011 as King Bramwell, Isabel's father. Singer noted the interest in casting McShane against type as a benevolent ruler rather than the more familiar antagonistic figures the actor had portrayed. The Giants presented a distinct casting challenge because they combined motion capture performance with voice work. Bill Nighy was selected to portray General Fallon, the two-headed leader of the Giants, providing both the primary voice and motion capture performance. John Cossier supplied the voice and performance for Fallon's smaller second head. Singer recounted that Nighy developed the distinctive gravelly voice by isolating himself in a car, closing the doors and windows, lying on the floor, and screaming for approximately 20 minutes before recording sessions. He repeated a similar process daily. Additional giant roles went to performers experienced in physical and voice work. Cornell John, credited in some listings as Cornell S. John, played Fee. Andrew Brooke portrayed Phi. Angus Barnett took on Foe, and Ben Daniels embodied Fum. The four lieutenants, whose names echo the traditional Phi Fum chant. Philip Fillmore performed as the Cook Giant. Peter Elliott covered a sentry and bugler giant, and Don McCorkindale handled a tongue giant. These actors worked within the performance capture volume, interacting with minimal physical references such as styrofoam blocks and wireframes while imagining the scale of Gantua. Further supporting players rounded out the human ensemble. Eddie Marsan was cast as Craw, Elmont's second-in-command. Ewan Bramner appeared as Vic, Roderick's attendant. Rolf Brown played General Entin, leader of King Bramwell's army. Christopher Fairbank portrayed Jack's uncle. Warwick Davis took the role of Old Ham, a carnival performer. Additional credited roles included Simon Lowe as a monk, Mingus Johnston as Bald, Joy McBrien as an old maid, Chris Brailsford as a blacksmith, Lee Boardman as Badger, and various smaller parts filled by performers such as Alex McQueen, tour guide, Tandy Wright, the Queen, Daniel Lapine, Jack's father, and child actors Michael Self, young Jack, and Sidney Rosen, young Isabel. Uncredited and day player roles expanded the crowd scenes, soldiers, and pantomime sequences that framed the story's fairy tale presentation. Casting director Naina Gold, Roger Mussenden, and Jeremy Rich oversaw the process. Gold and Mussenden were primary casting directors, with Rich also credited. Their work encompassed both the high-profile leads and the extensive supporting and motion capture ensembles required for a production that mixed live action with extensive digital characters. The British location of principal photography filmed largely in England, including sites in Somerset, Gloucestershire, Norfolk, and historic venues such as Wells Cathedral and Norwich Cathedral, facilitated access to a deep pool of UK-based talent. This geographic focus contributed to the predominantly British composition of the cast, with Tucci as the notable exception who adjusted his accent accordingly. Singer's approach to casting emphasized performers who could navigate the hybrid demands of the production. Live action sequences required traditional dramatic and action work, while interactions with the giants demanded imagination and precise timing against empty space or temporary reference objects. Howell described the experience of acting opposite non-existent giants as largely similar to conventional performance, simply requiring engagement with absent elements. Tomlinson found the technology a genuine challenge, but credited Singer's guidance in helping the cast trust the process. Tucci was more candid, noting that the motion capture work was not particularly enjoyable, even if the final results proved extraordinary. McGregor compared the slower pace of certain technical setups to watching paint dry, contrasting it with the faster rhythm of smaller independent films. These accounts illustrate how the casting choices had to account not only for character suitability but also for actor ability to sustain performance under specialized technical conditions. Hoult's selection as Jack reflected Singer's preference for an identifiable everyman rather than a conventional action hero. The character arc centers on growth from a somewhat aimless farmhand into a figure of courage, and Hall's prior work demonstrated both vulnerability and emerging strength. His height, while noted as a minor practical consideration opposite the giants, ultimately served the visual storytelling by allowing clear scale relationships once the digital characters were integrated. Tomlinson's Isabelle was written with greater agency than a pure damsel figure. Her multiple auditions tested both chemistry with Hoult and the capacity to project independence and resolve. The chemistry read proved particularly important for establishing the central relationship that develops across the narrative. The villainous Roderick required an actor comfortable with theatrical flourishes and calculated menace. Tucci's established ability to shift between charm and threat made him a strong match, and the British accent further integrated him into the film's world. McGregor's Elmont embodied the archetypal loyal knight, swashbuckling, capable, and loyal quality singer associated with classic adventure cinema. McShane's King Bromwell provided paternal authority tempered by the character's desire to protect his daughter while navigating political pressures, including the proposed marriage to Roderick. Nike's dual-headed Fallon needed a voice that conveyed both leadership and grotesque menace. The extreme preparation method, Singer described, produced a distinctive vocal performance that anchored the giant's hierarchy. Secondary human characters such as Marston's crow and Bremner's wick added texture to the expedition and court sequences. Marston's grounded intensity suited a reliable second in command, while Bremner's distinctive presence fit the more eccentric attendant role. Davis Oldham contributed to the framing device of the pantomime performance that opens and closes the story, linking the contemporary telling to the fairy tale tradition. The giant lieutenants Fee, Fi, Fo, and Fum required performers who could convey individual personalities within a collective threat. Their names directly referenced the classic chant, reinforcing the mythic foundation while allowing distinct physical and vocal characterizations through motion capture. Younger versions of the protagonists were cast with Michael Self as young Jack and Sidney Rosen as young Isabelle, establishing continuity in the character designs from childhood sequences into the main narrative. Additional family and court roles, Jack's father, Daniel Lapine or Tim Foley, in different credits listings, the Queen, Tandy Wright, and various soldiers, monks, and townspeople filled out the world of Cloister and provided the human scale against which the giants would appear. Pantomime performers and extras populated the theatrical framing sequences, reinforcing the film's self-aware relationship to traditional storytelling. The technical requirements of performance capture influenced the selection of actors for the giant roles beyond pure vocal talent. Performers needed the physical discipline to work in volume stages, responding to direction while wearing motion capture suits and delivering performances that would later be mapped onto digital models of vastly different proportions. Singer observed that the process recalled childhood play acting or minimalist theater, requiring imagination to inhabit environments that existed primarily as digital constructs. This demand shaped the casting of both the lead giant and the supporting giant characters, favoring actors with experience or adaptability in such specialized environments. Chemistry among the principal cast was tested early. Hoult and Tomlinson's chemistry read helped confirm their pairing, with Hoult later noting Tomlinson's immediate fishiness and ability to banter, qualities that matched the princess's required heroic edge. Ensemble reads involving the wider cast further refined the group dynamics for the Beanstalk expedition and court scenes. Singer's prior working relationships, most notably with Hoult from the X-Men production and with Macquarie on the script, created continuity that eased the integration of new cast members into the collaborative process. The overall composition of the cast leaned heavily British, reflecting both the fairy tale source material's cultural roots and the practical advantages of filming in the United Kingdom. This choice supported authentic accents and a cohesive tonal world, while still allowing for the selective inclusion of international talent such as Tucci, casting directors Gold, Musenden, and rich balanced star power for marketing visibility with character actors who could deliver the necessary texture in supporting roles. The result was an ensemble that mixed rising leads Hoult and Tomlinson with established names McGregor, Tucci, McShane, Nairi, and reliable character performers capable of elevating smaller parts. Audition and testing logistics involved travel and scheduling coordination across busy careers. Hoult's availability opened only after the Mad Max delay. Tomlinson endured a protracted series of callbacks that tested endurance as much as talent. Screen tests in London for the leads allowed Singer to evaluate candidates in person against the evolving script and technical plans. Once the principles were locked, supporting and motion capture casting proceeded in parallel with location scouting and visual effects pre-visualization, ensuring that by the start of principal photography in April 2011, the full ensemble was in place. Singer's comments on individual choices consistently emphasized suitability of temperament and prior demonstrated skill over pure physical type. Hoult's charm and acting ability outweighed height concerns. Tomlinson's audition energy secured the princess role. McGregor and Tucci were viewed as inherently right for their respective heroic and villainous functions. McShane offered an interesting inversion of expected type. Naive delivered the vocal intensity required for the lead giant. These rationales guided the final decisions and shaped the on-screen relationships that drive the narrative of adventure, romance, and conflict between the human kingdom and the giants of Gantua. The motion capture ensemble for the giants required additional layers of collaboration. Actors performed scenes in the volume that would later be refined against the live action plates, sometimes returning for secondary capture sessions to adjust timing and interaction once human performances were locked. This iterative process demanded flexibility and patience from the performers selected for those roles. Voice recording sessions further refined the giant's dialogue and personality, with Nike's preparation method illustrating the extreme lengths some actors went to in order to inhabit the characters fully. Child casting for the younger versions of Jack and Isabelle, as well as incidental young roles in the pantomime and village sequences, followed standard practices for protecting minor performers while securing age-appropriate matches to the adult leads. Continuity of appearance and demeanor between young and adult iterations of the protagonist helped establish the film's temporal framing. Background players and soldiers were drawn largely from local UK talent pools, supporting the production's logistical efficiency during the England-based shoot. Throughout the casting period, the project's shifting release dates and title changes from Jack the Giant Killer to Jack the Giant Slayer did not interrupt the momentum of assembling the ensemble. By the time cameras rolled in April 2011, the principal and supporting casts were locked, enabling Singer and the production team to focus on the complex interplay of live action performance capture, and eventual visual effects integration. The resulting ensemble provided the human foundation against which the digital giants would operate, ensuring that character relationships and emotional arcs remain grounded even as the scale of the adventure expanded into the realm of Gantua. The casting of the expedition party, Hoult's Jack, McGregor's Elmont, Marsan's Craw, and Tucci's Roderick, created a core group whose interpersonal tensions and alliances drive much of the middle act. Hoult's relative newcomer status as a lead opposite more seasoned performers such as McGregor and Tucci placed him in a position that mirrored Jack's own journey from ordinary farmhand to central figure in the conflict. Tomlinson's presence as the object of the rescue, yet also an active participant once freed, balanced the traditional quest structure with a more contemporary sense of agency. McShane's King Bramwell supplied the authority and stakes at the base of the beanstalk, while Nairis Fallon embodied the existential threat from above. Secondary giant performers and human supporting players ensured that both the Cloud Realm and the Kingdom of Cloister felt populated and lived in. The four lieutenants gave Fallon a court of distinct personalities. The various human soldiers, servants, and townspeople provided the texture of a functioning medieval society under threat. Davies's old harm and the pantomime cast reinforced the film's meta layer of storytelling, linking the on-screen events to the fairy tale tradition that inspired the project. In selecting performers for roles that required both conventional acting and technical adaptation to performance capture and 3D photography, the casting team prioritized versatility. Actors needed to deliver emotionally coherent performances under conditions that often lacked immediate visual feedback from co-stars or environments. Singer's experience with large-scale productions and his prior work with several of the principals helped streamline the integration of the ensemble. The final cast list, spanning leads, supporting players, motion capture specialists, and background artists, reflected a deliberate balance of star recognition, character depth, and technical capability suited to the demands of a modern fairy tale spectacle. Tail credits confirm the breadth of the ensemble. Beyond the principals already discussed, roles such as Janelle Anton, Ralph Brown, Fee, Cornell John, Foe, Angus Barnett, Farm Ben Daniels, the cook giant, Philip Fillmore, and numerous uncredited soldiers, extras, and pantomime performers completed the roster. Casting directors Nina Gold, Roger Musenden, and Jeremy Rich coordinated this range of talent, ensuring consistency of tone and capability across the production. The process, spanning from late 2010 screen tests through early 2011 finalization, established the human and hybrid elements that would interact throughout the film's narrative of beanstalks, giants, and emerging heroism. Hoult's journey from early interest through scheduling obstacles to final casting illustrates the contingency often present in large productions. Tomlinson's multi-stage audition process highlights the intensity of competition for a high-profile female lead in a major studio film. The rapid assembly of the supporting and giant casts in February and March 2011 demonstrates the efficiency once the leads were set. Singer's consistent emphasis on actors he admired or had worked with previously provided a through line of trust and familiarity that supported the more experimental technical aspects of the shoot. The resulting ensemble allowed the film to explore themes of courage, loyalty, ambition, and the collision of myth with human frailty through performances grounded in recognizable character work, even as the visual scale expanded. Each major casting choice, from Hall's accessible heroism to Nighy's imposing dual-headed antagonist, contributed a specific texture to the overall tapestry. Supporting players filled out the social and military hierarchies of Cloister and the hierarchical structure of the giants, creating a fully realized world for the central conflict. The casting director's oversight ensured that this complex roster cohered into a functional whole capable of meeting the production's ambitious technical and narrative goals. Performance capture requirements extended the traditional casting criteria into areas of physical endurance, imaginative responsiveness, and collaborative flexibility with visual effects teams. Actors selected for giant roles accepted the necessity of working without conventional sets or co-stars in many sequences, relying instead on direction, temporary markers, and later refinements. This specialized demand shaped both the primary and secondary giant casting, resulting in a group of performers whose contributions would be amplified and transformed through digital means, while retaining the essence of their original physical and vocal choices. The human cast preparation included familiarization with the 3D photography process and the practical challenges of interacting with elements that would only fully exist in post-production. Chemistry work between Hall and Tomlinson ensemble reads for the expedition, and individual character development sessions for figures such as Roderick and Elmont further refined the performances before cameras rolled. Singer's guidance, informed by his experience on previous large-scale projects, helped the cast navigate these hybrid demands. In total, the casting of Jack the Giant Slayer assembled a diverse yet cohesive group of actors whose individual strengths supported the film's blend of adventure, romance, comedy, and spectacle. From the lead search that settled on Hoult and Tomlinson, through the rapid securing of established names for key supporting roles, to the specialized selection of motion capture talent for the Giants, each stage built upon the previous to create the complete ensemble. The involvement of experienced casting directors and the director's clear preferences for certain performers streamlined the process, enabling the production to move into principal photography with a fully realized cast prepared for the unique challenges of the project. Production development and pre-production. The road to Jack the Giant Slayer began nearly 8 years before the film reached theaters. Screenwriter Darren Lemke first floated the concept in 2005, envisioning a modern effects-driven retelling of Jack and the Beanstalk long before the wave of grown-up fairy tale adaptations that would eventually populate multiplexes in the early 2010s. At the time he pitched it, films such as Alice in Wonderland, Red Riding Hood, and Snow White and the Huntsman had not yet been made, meaning Lemke was, in effect, anticipating a trend rather than following one. He later described his take on the material as a coming-of-age story built around a young man's journey, and he drew a direct comparison between his version of Jack and Luke Skywalker from the original Star Wars trilogy, a hero whose ordinary beginnings mask an extraordinary destiny. That framing would shape much of the film's eventual tone, less a children's bedtime story and more a swashbuckling adventure epic dressed in fairy tale clothing. For several years, the project moved slowly through development, as spec scripts often do in Hollywood, before finally gaining traction at New Line Cinema. In January 2009, the studio brought on director DJ Caruso, known at the time for tense, effects-assisted thrillers, to helm the picture. Screenwriter Mark Baumbach was subsequently brought in to rework Lemke's original draft. Caruso's tenure on the project, however, proved short-lived. By the middle of 2009, industry reports began circulating that Bryan Singer, the director behind The Usual Suspects and the first two X-Men films, was being considered as a replacement, and by September of that year, the change had become official. Singer's arrival marked the beginning of the version of the project that would eventually reach audiences. Once installed as director, Singer immediately turned to a familiar collaborator to help rebuild the screenplay, Christopher McQuarrie, with whom he had worked as far back as the low-budget 1993 drama Public Access, and again on The Usual Suspects, Apt Pupil, and the World War II thriller Valkyrie. Their reunion in April 2010 signaled that Singer intended to give the material a more substantial narrative backbone than a straightforward retelling of the classic tale would require. According to Singer, McQuarrie's contribution amounted to a near-total structural overhaul. The two had worked together enough times that their creative shorthand allowed for sweeping changes without derailing the production. But Singer was careful to note that while the plot mechanics shifted considerably, the essential cast of characters remained intact, simply reassigned to new roles within the reworked story. One of the more significant additions McQuarrie brought to the table was an expanded mythology for the giants themselves, Rather than treating them as generic monsters for the hero to defeat, the rewrite gave them a history, a hierarchy, and a specific dramatized relationship with the human characters, including the backstory of a magical crown capable of controlling them, forged from a giant's own heart. This decision to deepen the giant's world had consequences beyond storytelling. Singer has said that fleshing out Gantua, the giant's homeland, and giving the antagonist genuine narrative weight increased the scope and therefore the projected budget of the film considerably. To rein the budget back towards something more manageable, Singer subsequently brought aboard television writer Dan Studney, whose job was to help tighten the script without losing the texture McQuarrie had added. The finished screenplay that went into production credited all three writers, Lemke, McQuarrie, and Studney, working from the original story that Lemke and eventual co-story writer David Dobkin had developed. The production's timeline was also shaped by Singer's ambitions for how the film would be shot. In May 2010, entertainment outlets reported that the start of principal photography would be pushed back to February 2011, a delay attributed largely to Singer's interest in pre-visualizing scenes that would include the digital giants directly alongside the live-action performers on set, a technique inspired by the virtual production workflow James Cameron had pioneered on Avatar. Integrating that kind of real-time visualization into a shoot of this scale required considerable advanced planning, and the extra lead time was deemed necessary to work out the complexities involved. By October 2010, New Line Cinema had given Singer the formal green light to begin pre-production on what was then still titled Jack the Giant Killer, with actual filming targeted for the following spring. Pre-production during this period focused heavily on casting. Singer began screen testing actors for the two lead roles in November 2010. For the part of the young farmhand who would become the film's hero, the field of contenders included Aaron Johnson, Nicholas Hoult, and Aneurin Barnard, three young British actors who had each, by that point, built reputations in different corners of the industry. For the role of the princess, the studio tested Adelaide Kane, Lily Collins, and Juno Temple. Singer also used this period to discuss his technical approach to the production publicly. In December 2010, he expressed enthusiasm about shooting the film with the then new Red Epic digital camera system, specifically citing its suitability for 3D production given its compact size and high resolution. He noted that this would be his first film set in an era before electricity existed, meaning that the way natural and practical light would need to be captured and rendered on camera was a distinct challenge compared to his earlier work, and he suggested the camera's wide exposure latitude would help him explore that visual world more effectively. Casting decisions accelerated through the first months of 2011. In February, The Hollywood Reporter announced that Stanley Tucci had signed on to play Lord Roderick, the scheming royal advisor who serves as the film's human antagonist. In the same period, Bill Nighy and John Cassar were cast as the two halves of General Fallon, the two-headed leader of the Giants, a role that would combine voice work with full-body motion capture performance, with Nighy providing the larger dominant head and Cassar voicing the smaller secondary head that bickers with it throughout the film. Later that month, Nicholas Hoult was formally offered the lead role of Jack. Singer had been an admirer of Hoult's work going back to the British television series Skins, and had been supportive of the actor's subsequent casting in X-Men. First Class, a film Singer produced and which shared a studio relationship with the X-Men franchise singer himself had launched a decade earlier. Shortly afterward, Ewan McGregor joined the cast as Elmont, the head of the King's Royal Guard, who accompanies Jack on the quest into giant territory. March 2011 brought the final major pieces of principal casting into place. Eleanor Tomlinson was cast opposite Hoult as Princess Isabelle, and Ian McShane joined the production as King Bramwell, Isabel's father and the ruler of the fictional kingdom of Cloister. 2 days after McShane's casting was announced, New Line Cinema and its parent distributor Warner Bros. Pictures set an initial release date of June 15, 2012, a date that would later be pushed back twice before the film's actual premiere. With its principal cast now assembled, the production entered its final stage of pre-production. Location scouting, set construction, costume design, and the extensive technical planning required for a film built around motion capture giants, digital environments, and large-scale 3D photography. The pre-production period for Jack the Giant Slayer was, in many respects, as consequential as the shoot itself, since so much of the film's eventual identity, its scale, its visual approach, and its blend of practical and digital performance was locked in during these months of testing, casting, and script refinement before a single frame of the finished film was captured. Filming principal photography on Jack the Giant Slayer began on April 12, 2011 in the English countryside, marking the start of a shoot that would take the production across several distinctive regions of Britain over the following weeks. Shooting entirely on location in England allowed the filmmakers to draw on a landscape already steeped in the visual vocabulary of medieval fantasy, rolling farmland, ancient stone architecture, and dense atmospheric woodlawn, all of which suited the film's setting in the fictional, vaguely medieval kingdom of Cloister. In May 2011, the production relocated to Somerset for a 2-week stretch of filming. Scenes were shot in and around the towns of Wells and Cheddar, along with additional locations in the county that were kept confidential at the time. Among the most significant of these Somerset locations was Wells Cathedral, whose soaring Gothic architecture provided a ready-made backdrop for the film's royal court scenes, lending the production an air of historical grandeur that would have been costly and time-consuming to construct from scratch on a soundstage. That same month, the crew also filmed at Puzzlewood, an ancient woodland in the Forest of Dean near Colford, Gloucestershire. Puzzlewood is known for its unusual rock formations and gnarled, twisting trees, features that have made it a popular filming location for British television productions, including episodes of Doctor Who and Merlin. The forest carries a particular resonance within the broader fantasy genre. It is often cited as one of the landscapes that helped inspire J.R.R. Tolkien's conception of Middle-earth while he was writing The Hobbit. For a film explicitly engaging with the roots of fairy tale storytelling, shooting in a location tied to one of the 20th century's most influential fantasy authors added a layer of thematic appropriateness to the production's choice of setting. Whether or not that connection was a deliberate consideration during scouting, later in May, the production moved to Norwich Cathedral in Norfolk, adding another grand ecclesiastical structure to the film's roster of real-world locations, standing in for the fictional kingdom's architecture. Between the cathedrals of Wells and Norwich and the primeval woodland of Puzzlewood, the production assembled a patchwork of English locations that, when combined with extensive visual effects work in post-production, would form the geography of Cloister and its surrounding countryside. shooting a large-scale fantasy adventure with a cast of giants who would not physically exist on set presented the production with unusual technical demands, and much of the filming process was built around motion capture performance. Actors portraying the giants, including Bill Nighy, John Cassar, Cornell John, Andrew Brooke, Angus Barnett, and Ben Daniels, among others, performed their roles using motion capture suits and markers, allowing their physical movements and, in some cases, facial performances to be recorded digitally and later translated into the towering computer-generated characters seen in the finished film. Singer, discussing the motion capture process, described it as an experience that pulled the actors back toward the kind of imaginative play acting of childhood, since performers were often required to react to threats, environments, and scale relationships that existed only in their imaginations and in reference materials, working against little more than foam props and blocking marks on an otherwise bare set or stage. He noted that despite the absence of finished visual context during the actual shoot, the process had its own peculiar fascination, and he drew a comparison to the way filmmakers such as Robert Zemeckis and James Cameron had, each in their own ways, adopted performance capture heavy production methods for their own effects driven films. The blending of traditional live action photography with motion capture performance meant the shoot required careful choreography between the human actors, Hoult, Tomlinson, Tucci, McGregor, and the rest of the ensemble, and their digital co-stars, who were often represented on set by stand-ins, reference markers, or nothing at all, with the giants to be composited in later. This kind of hybrid production, mixing a traditional English location shoot with a heavily digital creature performance pipeline, placed Jack the Giant Slayer in a lineage of early 2010s tentpole films that were increasingly reliant on the ability to blend photographed and computer-generated elements seamlessly, a technical challenge that would occupy a significant portion of the film's post-production schedule. Filming continued through the spring of 2011, with the production's British countryside locations providing the raw photographic material, actors, castles, forests, cathedrals, and rolling hills that visual effects artists would later use as the foundation onto which they built the film's massive beanstalks, its towering giants, and the elevated cloud-wreathed realm of Gantua. Post-production on Jack the Giant Slayer proved to be an unusually long and consequential phase of the film's overall journey to theaters, driven in large part by the sheer scale of the visual effects work required and by the studio's evolving marketing calculus. In January 2012, roughly 8 months after principal photography had concluded, Warner Bros. Announced that it was pushing the film's release date back by 9 months from the originally announced June 15, 2012 to March 22, 2013. The Hollywood Reporter offered an explanation for the timing at the time, noting that Warner Bros. Could reasonably absorb the delay in part because Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises was set to anchor the studio's summer slate that July, freeing the release calendar of a direct scheduling conflict. The trade publication also observed that pushing Jack the Giant Slayer back gave the production significantly more time to complete its visual effects work to a satisfactory standard, while also creating an opportunity to attach the film's marketing trailers to Peter Jackson's The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, which was set for a high-profile Christmas 2012 release and shared obvious genre and tonal affinities with Jack the Giant Slayer. The release date shifted a second time in October 2012 when Warner Bros. Moved the film forward again, this time to March 1, 2013, 3 weeks earlier than the previously announced date. This same announcement brought with it a more visible change. The film's title was altered from Jack the Giant Killer to Jack the Giant Slayer, the name under which it would ultimately be marketed and released. The rating likely reflected, among other considerations, a desire to sidestep confusion with unrelated media bearing similar names, as well as an effort to sharpen the film's marketing identity ahead of its theatrical run. The extended post-production window was put to use primarily on the film's extensive digital effects work, which involved 7 separate visual effects companies working in tandem: Digital Domain, Giant Studios, the Third Floor Moving Picture Company, MPC, Soho VFX, Rodeo FX, and Hatch Productions. Coordinating a visual effects pipeline of this size across multiple vendor studios required careful division of labor, with different houses typically responsible for different sequences, characters, or categories of effects work, all of which needed to be integrated into a single consistent visual style by the time the film reached its final cut. The creation of the film's giants, arguably the single most technically demanding element of the production, was broken down into 4 distinct stages. The first stage, referred to as pre-capture, involved recording the performing actors' facial and body movements through motion capture technology and rendering rough versions of their giant characters within a real-time virtual environment, essentially building a digital rehearsal of each sequence before the human actors ever stepped in front of a camera. The second stage took place during principal photography itself, when the production used simulcam technology, a system that overlays digital elements onto a live camera feed in real time, to let the human cast members see and react to a rough visualization of the giants as they perform their scenes, helping actors like Hoult, Tomlinson, and McGregor orient their eye lines, blocking, and physical reactions to characters who would not be fully rendered until much later in the process. The third stage, called post-capture, involved a second, separate motion capture shoot conducted specifically to refine and adjust the giants' movements so that their digital performances would mesh seamlessly with the already completed live-action footage. The fourth and final stage encompassed the more traditional work of digital finishing, applying detailed animation, skin textures, hair simulation, clothing, and final compositing to integrate the giants convincingly into each shot alongside the photographed human actors and environments alongside the giants. The production's other major recurring visual element, the magic beanstalk itself, required its own dedicated effects approach built around 2 main technical requirements. The first was set extension work for any shot in which the human actors needed to physically interact with the beanstalk. These sequences were filmed against blue screen with practical beanstalk elements built to a scale the actors could climb, touch, or otherwise engage with directly, and then extended digitally to convey the plant's true towering scale. The second requirement was fully computer generated animation for sequences depicting the beanstalk actively growing, whether shooting rapidly up from the earth into the clouds or, in the film's climax, being cut down and collapsing back toward the ground. These fully digital beanstalk sequences had no practical photographic component at all and were built entirely within the visual effects pipeline. Beyond the technical mechanics of the effects work, Singer has spoken about the tonal calibration required to make a film with this much on-screen violence and destruction still function as accessible, family-friendly entertainment. He has said the film likely contains a larger on-screen body count than any other project he had directed up to that point, and that translating that level of carnage into something that would read as exciting rather than disturbing for a broad audience, including young viewers, was one of the more delicate balancing acts of the production. He connected this challenge to the tonal template set by earlier adventure films like Raiders of the Lost Ark and the original Star Wars trilogy, both of which managed to depict considerable danger and death while still maintaining a sense of buoyant escapist fun rather than grimness. And he suggested that achieving a similar tonal register was central to how the film's action and violence were ultimately staged, edited, and rated. The post-production process was also where the film's musical score, editing, and final sound design came together under the guidance of composer and editor John Ottman, whose dual role on the project, contributing both as the film's editor and as its composer, in addition to serving as an associate producer, gave him an unusually integrated hand in shaping the finished film's rhythm, pacing, and emotional texture during this final stage of assembly. Music, the score for Jack the Giant Slayer, was composed by John Ottman, a longtime creative collaborator of Bryan Singer's, whose relationship with the director stretches back to the very beginning of both of their careers. Ottman's work on Jack the Giant Slayer marked his seventh collaboration with Singer, a partnership that began with the low-budget 1993 film Public Access and continued through The Usual Suspects, Apt Pupil, X-Men United, Superman Returns, and Valkyrie. Across that run of films, Ottman took on multiple roles beyond composing, frequently serving as editor as well. And Jack the Giant Slayer continued that pattern, with Ottman credited as both composer and editor, alongside an associate producer credit. Ottman's musical approach to the film leaned into a sweeping orchestral idiom appropriate to a large-scale fantasy adventure, built around a central theme associated with the film's two young leads, Jack and Isabelle. The soundtrack album, released under the title Jack the Giant Slayer Original Motion Picture Soundtrack, was issued on February 26, 2013, the same day as the film's Hollywood premiere, through Water Tower Music, the Warner Bros. Affiliated label responsible for distributing much of the studio's film score output. The album's 22 tracks trace the film's narrative arc from its opening scene setting cues through its climactic battle and denouement. The soundtrack opens with the Jack and Isabelle theme from Jack the Giant Slayer, a piece that establishes the melodic identity carried through much of the score, before moving into shorter functional cues such as Logomania and to Cloister that serve to orient the audience within the film's medieval setting. Subsequent tracks map onto key story beats and set pieces. The Climb and Welcome to Gantua accompany the film's transitions between the human world and the realm of the giants. Fee appears, and Waking a Sleeping Giant underscores specific encounters with individual giant characters, and Power of the Crown ties into the film's central magical artifact, the crown capable of commanding the giants. The back half of the album's track listing follows the film's escalating action with cues such as Roderick's Demise, The Beanstalk Falls, Kitchen Nightmare, Chase to Gloucester, and the nearly 6-minute The Battle, scoring the film's climactic confrontation between the human characters and the invading giant army. The album closes with Sniffing Out Fear, All Is Lost, and The New King Stories, the latter serving as a musical bookend to the film's opening theme and underscoring the story's resolution and its transformation within the film's own fiction into a fairy tale passed down through generations. In total, the released soundtrack runs a little over 72 minutes, offering a fairly complete accounting of the film's score across its various tonal registers, from intimate character-driven cues to full-scale orchestral battle music. Ottman's score for the film sits within a broader tradition of large orchestra fantasy adventure scoring that draws, whether directly or by genre convention, on the tonal vocabulary established by earlier composers working in similar territories: sweeping string themes for romance and wonder, propulsive brass and percussion for action, and thematic material tied to specific characters or objects that recurs and develops across the runtime. Given Ottman's dual role as editor, the score was also shaped in close conjunction with the film's cutting, allowing him to time musical beats precisely against the visual rhythm of scenes. He was simultaneously assembling, a workflow advantage relatively rare in feature filmmaking, where composer and editor are typically separate individuals working somewhat independently before a final mix brings their contributions together. Released theatrical, Jack the Giant Slayer held its premiere on Tuesday, February 26, 2013 at the TCL Chinese Theatre in Los Angeles, California, one of Hollywood's most storied premiere venues and a traditional site for major studio launch events. The premiere took place several days ahead of the film's wide theatrical release, allowing press, industry figures, and invited guests an early look at the finished film before it opened to the general public. The film's wide release followed on March 1, 2013, distributed domestically by Warner Bros. Pictures. In the days leading up to that release, pre-release tracking data suggested the film was on pace to open in the range of $30 million to $35 million over its first weekend in North America, a projection that, while not disastrous on its face, was regarded within the industry as a disappointing figure, given that the film had cost at least $185 million to produce, with some reports suggesting the true budget had climbed closer to $200 million. Once additional costs were factored in, ahead of its official Friday opening, the film generated roughly $400,000 from Thursday night preview screenings and midnight showings, a relatively modest start for a film of its scale, and one that foreshadowed the softer than hoped commercial reception the film would go on to receive. When the full opening weekend numbers were tallied, Jack the Giant Slayer had grossed approximately $28 million in North America, playing across roughly 3,500 locations. Despite the modest total, this figure was enough to place the film in first position at the domestic box office for the weekend, a reflection less of overwhelming audience turnout and more of a relatively uncompetitive release slate during that particular early March frame. Demographic data gathered around the opening weekend indicated that the audience skewed 55% male, with 56% of ticket buyers over the age of 25, a distribution notably older and more male skewed than the family audience. The studio had reportedly hoped to attract with its marketing campaign. The film's international rollout ran in parallel with its domestic release, and its performance overseas offered an early counterpoint to its middling North American numbers. In roughly the same opening period, Jack the Giant Slayer earned an additional $13,700,000 across 10 Asian markets, playing in around 1,800 locations in that region alone. This relatively strong showing internationally and in Asian markets specifically would end up representing a meaningful share of the film's eventual global total, underscoring how international box office performance had by the early 2010s, become an increasingly critical component of a big budget studio release's overall commercial fate as the film continued its theatrical run through March and into April 2013. Industry analysts grew increasingly pessimistic about its prospects for turning a profit. Roughly 4 weeks into its release, The Hollywood Reporter published analysis suggesting the film was on track to lose somewhere between $125 million and $140 million for Legendary Pictures, one of the studios financially backing the production alongside Warner Bros. And New Line Cinema. That same reporting projected the film would likely finish its run around $200 million in worldwide box office receipts, a total that, while substantial in absolute terms, would still fall short of covering the film's combined production and marketing expenditure once all costs were accounted for. Jack the Giant Slayer ultimately closed out its theatrical run on June 13, 2013, having played in theaters for roughly 3.5 months. Its final tally came to just over $65 million in North America and approximately $197,700,000 worldwide, set against a reported production budget in the range of $185 to $200 million. Before factoring in the substantial additional costs of a global marketing and print and advertising campaign for a film of this scale, the final numbers left Jack the Giant Slayer classified within the industry as a box office disappointment, if not an outright bomb, depending on how conservatively one estimated the film's true all-in costs. In examining the reasons behind the film's underwhelming commercial performance, industry analysts and entertainment journalists pointed to a fundamental tension at the heart of the project, a mismatch between Bryan Singer's inclination toward a somewhat darker, more mature take on the material and the studio's evident desire for a broadly appealing, family-friendly tentpole. This tension, according to that analysis, resulted in a finished film that split the difference in a way that satisfied neither audience fully, landing with a PG-13 rating that placed it in an awkward middle ground. Too intense in places for the youngest viewers, the marketing seemed to be courting, yet not distinctive or edgy enough to carve out a clear identity among adult moviegoers, weighing their options at the multiplex. That perceived identity confusion, layered on top of a spring release date that lacked the same cultural momentum as a summer or holiday tentpole slot, was cited as a central factor in explaining why a film with this level of financial and technical investment failed to connect with audiences at a scale commensurate with its budget. Home media. Following the conclusion of its theatrical run, Jack the Giant Slayer moved toward a home media release in the spring and early summer of 2013. In April of that year, Warner Home Video formally announced the film's upcoming release across multiple home entertainment formats, including Blu-ray 3D, standard Blu-ray disc, and DVD, a format spread reflective of the fact that the film had originally been produced and exhibited theatrically in 3D, making a corresponding 3D home release a natural complement to the standard high definition and standard definition options. The physical media release arrived in stores on June 18, 2013, just 5 days after the film's theatrical run had officially concluded, a relatively tight turnaround between theatrical closure and home availability, though one broadly consistent with typical studio release windows of the period. Warner Home Video structured the release across two distinct packaging configurations to accommodate different consumer preferences and playback capabilities. The first was a 3-disc combination pack that bundled the 3D Blu-ray version of the film alongside a standard 2D Blu-ray disc and a DVD, intended for consumers equipped with 3D capable televisions and players who wanted the fullest possible format coverage in a single purchase. The second was a more streamlined 2-disc combo pack pairing a standard Blu-ray disc with a DVD, aimed at the larger segment of the home video market that had not adopted 3D display technology. Both editions of the home media release were bundled with a consistent set of bonus features. Chief among these was a behind-the-scenes feature titled Become a Giant Slayer, which offered viewers a look at aspects of the film's production, presumably touching on some combination of the motion capture performance process, the visual effects pipeline, and the practical location shooting that had taken place across England 2 years earlier. Alongside the featurette, both packages included a selection of deleted scenes that had been trimmed from the theatrical cut, along with a gag reel compiling on-set bloopers and outtakes gathered during filming, a fairly standard inclusion for studio home releases of this era, offering audiences a lighter, more informal counterpoint to the film's largely earnest tone. Rounding out the bonus content, both editions also included a digital copy of the film, allowing purchasers to redeem and download or stream a digital version for playback on computers, tablets, and other devices, a feature that had become increasingly standard on major studio home release ends as digital viewing habits continued to expand alongside traditional physical media formats. The home media release represented the final major distribution phase of the film's initial rollout following its theatrical premiere, wide release, and international run, and it offered the studio an additional avenue to recoup some portion of the substantial investment that had gone into the film's protracted development, production, and post-production process. Reception box office Jack the Giant Slayer's box office performance, considered in full, tells a story of a film that generated respectable but ultimately insufficient revenue relative to its enormous production costs, against a reported budget in the range of $185 to $200 million. The film's worldwide gross of approximately $197,700,000 left very little room for profitability once the substantial costs of global marketing, prints, and advertising were factored in on top of the base production budget. Industry convention generally holds that a studio film needs to gross somewhere in the range of 2 to 2.5 times its production budget worldwide simply to break even. Once marketing and distribution costs and the revenue sharing arrangements with theater chains are taken into account. By that standard, a worldwide total roughly equal to the film's production budget alone represented a significant financial shortfall. The film's domestic performance, in particular, underscored the disconnect between its scale and its audience reception. A North American total of just over $65 million is a modest sum for a film that had been positioned, marketed, and budgeted as a major studio tentpole release, comparable in scope and ambition to other large-scale fantasy adventures of the period. The opening weekend figure of roughly $28 million, while enough to claim the top spot at the box office in a relatively uncompetitive early March frame, fell well short of the $30 to $35 million range that pre-release tracking had projected, itself already considered a soft number for a film of this budget level. International box office performance offered a somewhat brighter counterpoint, particularly in Asian markets. where the film's early results outpaced its comparatively tepid domestic reception. This pattern, a big budget, effects driven fantasy or action film, finding more enthusiastic audiences overseas than at home, was not unique to Jack the Giant Slayer and reflected a broader trend that had become increasingly pronounced in Hollywood's approach to blockbuster filmmaking throughout the 2010s. As international markets, and particularly those in Asia, grew to represent an ever larger share of major studio releases' total worldwide earnings. Financial analysis published partway through the film's theatrical run offered a sobering assessment of its prospects, with one report estimating potential losses in the range of $125 million to $140 million for Legendary Pictures specifically, one of the financiers behind the production. Such projections, while necessarily somewhat speculative given the difficulty of precisely calculating a studio film's true net financial performance from outside figures, were broadly consistent with the film's eventual disappointing final worldwide total. By the time the film closed its theatrical run in mid-June 2013, having played for roughly 15 weeks, the consensus within the industry was that Jack the Giant Slayer represented a clear commercial underperformance relative to its budget, even if its absolute worldwide gross was not so low as to place it among the very worst box office failures of its era. Analysts examining the reasons behind the shortfall converged on a few recurring explanations. Chief among these was the tension between the film's tonal ambitions and its marketing positioning, the sense that Singer's inclination toward a somewhat harder, more adult sensibility sat uneasily alongside a marketing campaign apparently designed to attract families and younger viewers, resulting in a film that struggled to build strong word-of-mouth momentum with either audience segment. The film's PG-13 rating, positioned between the more family-friendly G and PG classifications and the more clearly adult-oriented R rating, was frequently cited as symptomatic of this broader identity confusion. Not gentle enough to be an easy, worry-free choice for parents of young children, yet not distinctive or mature enough to stand out as appointment viewing for older teenagers and adults with abundant entertainment options. Additional contextual factors likely played a role as well, including the film's early March release date, a period of the calendar that has historically produced fewer runaway box office successes than the more heavily trafficked summer and holiday release windows, and the general difficulty original, non-sequel, non-franchise properties faced in cutting through an increasingly crowded marketplace of established intellectual property by the early 2010s. Critical response, critical reaction to Jack the Giant Slayer upon its release was in aggregate decidedly mixed. A verdict reflected clearly in the film's scores across the major review aggregation platforms tracking critical consensus at the time. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film settled at a 52% approval rating based on 208 collected reviews, with an average score of 5.70 out of 10 among those reviews. The site's official critical consensus characterized the film as energetically performed and reasonably entertaining on its own terms, while also noting that it tended to be overshadowed by its heavy reliance on digital effects and by a narrative that many reviewers found somewhat generic and emotionally distant. On Metacritic, which aggregates and weights critical reviews on a 100-point scale, the film registered a score of 51 out of 100 based on 37 critics, a result the platform classified as falling into the mixed or average range, a categorization that closely mirrored the broader critical picture painted by its Rotten Tomatoes numbers. Audience reaction, as measured by the market research firm CinemaScore, which surveys opening night moviegoers as they exit theaters, proved somewhat more favorable than the critical consensus. Audiences surveyed gave the film a grade of B+ on CinemaScore's letter grade scale running from A to F, suggesting that those who did choose to see the film in its opening days generally came away with a positive impression, even if that enthusiasm did not translate into the kind of robust word of mouth growth over subsequent weekends that can sometimes carry a film to outsized box office success, despite a soft opening. Individual reviews from prominent critics captured the range of opinion that produced these middling aggregate scores. On the more favorable end of the spectrum, Todd McCarthy, writing for The Hollywood Reporter, offered praise for the film's narrative clarity and pacing, drawing a specific point of comparison to Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, which had been released a few months earlier. McCarthy argued that in terms of straightforward, efficient storytelling and sustained audience engagement, Jack the Giant Slayer compared favorably to Jackson's more sprawling and, in McCarthy's estimation, less tightly constructed epic. Richard Roper, reviewing the film for the Chicago Sun-Times, was similarly positive, characterizing the film as a spirited, original and consistently entertaining adventure, positioning it as a satisfying piece of populist genre filmmaking rather than judging it against loftier artistic ambitions. Other prominent critics were considerably less impressed. Justin Chang, writing for Variety, was skeptical of the film's originality, framing it as an effort to capitalize on the broader trend of fairy tale adaptations then in vogue, and arguing that its assemblage of familiar storybook characters, plot situations, and large-scale battle sequences produced results that felt mechanical and predictable rather than fresh or surprising. Manala Dargis of the New York Times offered a similarly unenthusiastic take, describing the film in essence as a technically souped up but conceptually shallow rendition of the Jack and the Beanstalk story, suggesting that its heavy reliance on digital spectacle did little to compensate for a fairly thin underlying narrative. Kenneth Turan, reviewing for the Los Angeles Times, took a comparably critical stance, suggesting that while the film had clearly benefited from a substantial budget in terms of its production values and visual polish, it was ultimately let down by weaknesses in its screenplay. Taken together, this spread of opinion, genuine enthusiasm from some established critics set against real disappointment from others, with a solidly middle-of-the-road aggregate score across both major review platforms, placed Jack the Giant Slayer squarely in the category of films that generated no strong critical consensus in either direction. It was neither dismissed outright as a failure of craft nor embraced broadly as a standout entry in the modern fairy tale adaptation cycle. It had, in a sense, helped anticipate years earlier when Darren Lemke first pitched the concept back in 2005. The film did receive some measure of industry recognition despite its mixed critical standing and disappointing box office return, including a nomination from the Phoenix Film Critics Society in its Overlooked Film of the Year category for 2013, an award category specifically designed to call attention to films that its voting body felt had not received the audience or critical attention their quality warranted. A fitting, if modest, coda to a production whose ambitious, effects-heavy vision for a classic fairy tale ultimately found a more divided reception than its creators had likely hoped for when the project first began taking shape nearly a decade earlier.